Dan's going to play Dean, and I'm going to play New York City savior, which is how I described Dan. I said to Dan, New York has come off very well today. But we were just talking for a moment before, and I thought maybe the best way to begin this conversation was to just reflect for a moment on the conversations today, which I really I found in each of the panels there was this very interesting sort of hybrid between identifying the kind of really significant challenges faced by issues of migration and climate in cities, the intersectionality among those issues, and there was plenty of good old science to scare the shit out of us. And at the same time, there was a tremendous amount of hope and possibility presented through a range of different policy design and advocacy sort of solutions. And so there was this mixture, and the questions in some ways went back and forth on each of the panels around this sort of the darkness and the possibility. And I was thinking about, actually on my desk at home, there are two small books that, for a range of reasons, I'm going through right now. One of them is Roy Scranton's Learning to Die in the Anthropocene, which is a sort of reflection on the challenges of this time. It's actually a new school, very interesting little
comedy,
book.
right?
It's not a comedy. And the other is Rebecca Solnit's Darkness, Hope in the Dark, which is a kind of which has been reissued, and again written at a time of, initially written in I think 2004, 2005, both of which, interestingly, Roy's book and Rebecca's book, reflecting on experiences in Iraq as a sort of starting point. And in each case, they sort of find these different narratives, one thinking about sort of philosophically the issues of the challenges of the Anthropocene, the other sort of finding these untold stories and possibilities and hope in these same moments. And I found that today's conference kind of goes back and forth between these two. And so I thought it'd be interesting to ask you the question in part because you deal with these, incredibly complex challenges at the scale of the largest city in the United States, at the scale of a kind of intersectionality that climate and sustainability and resilience all present. And there's a sort of, one could easily imagine despair. And at the same time, one requires a sort of hopefulness and possibility of making change. And I'm so impressed by the work that's happened, and I'm kind of curious to start our conversation of how does one remain hopeful in the context of these challenges, and how does that work? How do you not go home and want to bury your head under the pillow?
I think, for those who don't know me, my name is Dan Zarilli. I'm the Senior Director for Climate Policy and Programs, and I oversee our climate adaptation, our sustainability work, as well as our accountability work. And I can talk a little bit about what each of those components are. But to answer your question, partly I think that I'm trained as an engineer by my background, although they don't teach you any of this topic area in engineering school, and they should. But against my better judgment, I'm an optimist. And I think I come to that conclusion largely because while we see the challenges and we can scare the pants off ourselves with thinking about how much water there's going to be and how much more heat there's going to be and what that's going to mean, I'm also struck by just historically, the adaptive nature of humanity. And not that every adaptation over time has been good, but we've certainly adapted. And I think we've started to come to some better conclusions on how we adapt so that we're more aware of being inclusive, we're more aware of equitable outcomes, and that we are thinking of these things in a combined way. And those are the things that give me hope. When we do our work around climate and we talk about greenhouse gas emissions and we're trying to pursue more renewable energy and we are planting more trees and we're doing flood protection and all this sort of technocratic work, it's all grounded in people, and it has to be grounded in the communities we serve, the neighborhoods we serve. And that gives you, I think, incredible grounding in the issues we face, but it also allows us to take it outside of the technocratic and just thinking about the 5 boroughs and what we're doing here, because climate change presents a set of challenges that even if we were to cut all of our greenhouse gas emissions, if we were to fully adapt our physical built environment, well, these changes are happening on a global scale. They are not just water and heat challenges. The water and heat and other physical risks are going to translate into potential conflict, food insecurity, public health challenges, and yes, migration. And thinking of all of these becomes even more daunting when you attempt to think of the intersected nature of the challenges. And yet, it's also important to break things up into pieces and not get so overwhelmed that you don't take any action, and you can't be overwhelmed by the apocalypse that is sometimes presented. There are certain scientists that are regularly showing maps of what New York City will look like with 30 meters of sea level rise, and it's like, all right, well, game over. That's not what we're dealing with. I can't prepare for the year 3000 right now. But what we can deal with is what we have right in front of us, and we can take steps, but we have to do it together, and we have to understand that these are not just technocratic challenges. This is a challenge of humanity, and we need to keep that humanity in all of our work.
But so, I mean, in a way, you gave a kind of pragmatic answer on the one hand and a visionary answer on the other. So how do you marry those two things in the work? I mean, it's also, there's a political dimension to this.
Well, there certainly is a political dimension, and we are, the de Blasio administration is in office for another term, and so we have another 4 years or 3.5 years to continue moving this ball forward, and we're doing a lot of things.
Do you have one of those clocks that runs backwards like your predecessors?
So we don't. I think we found that those were counterproductive to people actually working on the challenges that we have. They can be helpful in some contexts, I suppose. But it's important, and what we did as a city is laid out a strategic vision, One NYC. And we just released our progress report on that. But in 2015, we put together a strategic vision for inclusive growth and climate action that cuts across a lot of the city's efforts. And it really is our strategic plan for achieving the city that we want to ultimately hand over to our kids. And so there's certainly a visionary aspect for how we are dealing with the challenges we face, whether it's climate change, the fact that we continue to grow in population, which is certainly good, but also brings challenges, the fact that our infrastructure is aging, and the growing inequality crisis, and how do we deal with all of that together? But once you at least establish the vision of where you want to get to, you have to break it up into the individual tasks of, here are the things we're doing. We're expanding pre-K, and we're expanding IDNYC, and at the same time, we're cutting our greenhouse gases, and we're working on flood protection on the Lower East Side, and all of these things have to fit the vision, otherwise they are, you have a tendency to just go off in lots of different directions. Establishing a common vision, I think, is incredibly important so that then all of the tasks and all the things we're doing fit into that. And so it is a marrying of the vision and the practical, and you can get lost in the practical, right? And so there's so many details and so many things that we're doing that you can just easily get lost in your work that way. But as long as it stays connected to the vision, you are moving in the right direction. And I think that's been helpful for us as a city.
So you know this, Dan, and everyone in the audience knows that Maya Wiley was supposed to be with us because her name is in the pamphlet for the conference today, and you heard this morning when Mary Watson was making the introductory remarks that the panel on gun violence that includes a couple of the students from Parkland and a student from New York and a student from Chicago is what she is in the midst of actually setting up to start after this, and so that's why she sends her regrets and couldn't be here. But I talked to Maya last night, and of course you know her from the de Blasio administration, and I promised that I would bring this into the conversation, which I won't say as well as Maya would have, but she was really focused on the question of both the opportunities and the risks associated with communities at risk, communities of color, communities of underrepresentation, in relationship to these questions of environment, climate, migration, and the impacts on the city. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how the city is approaching those issues.
Sure. I think we have a really great example of how our climate action is being done in a new way that can help promote equity and can make ourselves more inclusive. We announced a program last summer called Cool Neighborhoods NYC. It's a heat mitigation program. Heat kills more New Yorkers than any other natural hazard. And when you look at the data, it is the most heat vulnerable residents, and this is analysis that's been done by our health department, the most heat vulnerable neighborhoods and heat vulnerable residents are congregated, and there's some pretty I guess, unsurprising if you've been in this work, but maybe surprising elements. It's not just about tree canopy coverage and the amount of blacktop, but it's also largely driven by poverty, and it's largely driven by race. And so on the map, what pops out is in central Brooklyn or the South Bronx or northern Manhattan. And so as we were developing our heat mitigation plan, it wasn't just a fact of, okay, let's plant trees everywhere or let's coat roofs everywhere. We really needed to target our efforts first in the areas of highest vulnerability, and that's exactly what we're doing. It's over a $100 million program. We're planting more trees, coating roofs. There's a social resilience component. We're working with local community-based organizations through Be a Buddy, where we're marrying up heat-vulnerable residents, specifically with volunteers. And we're doing it targeted in those neighborhoods and working with community-based organizations in those neighborhoods to make it work. And so I think this is a new way that we've come to how we need to make sure that we are recognizing that the inequities that exist in our city and how we're dealing with the challenges of climate change and making sure that we're investing to reduce those disparities and improve the whole city at the same time. And so I think for us, that's a really important example of how One NYC is coming to life and how the vision becomes practical and how it becomes real out in our communities.
And have you made progress in presenting this both both from a social justice perspective, but also from a kind of economic perspective for the city, that investment in cost avoided and in improved outcomes and in terms of education and other factors, by doing this level of investment, you're really building a better future? I mean, is the city talking about it that way?
I think it's clear, and certainly there's been a growing body of evidence that planting trees and improving open spaces improves communities and certainly property values and other economic indices. That's not necessarily our first priority for the program. It really was driven around heat vulnerability. But in a lot of cases, those do marry up, and of course the policies align in a nice way in certain communities. But what we're really trying to do is deal with the heat vulnerability and make sure we're improving our street tree canopy coverage, make sure we're dealing with the urban heat island effect, and coating roofs white is a major way that we can do that. So I see it as very much an environmental justice lens that we're applying to the work that we do, and dealing with the history of what's happened in our city and doing everything we can to make better decisions going forward.
We can go back and forth for a while, but I want to open up. If you have some thoughts or questions, we can bring some in. I know that we're going to, I don't know, Alex, how much time. We have about 20 minutes, I think, right? So I want to keep having a conversation, but think about some questions if you'd like to jump in here, and sort of find your way down to the microphones to do so. The last time we were on this stage, which was in January, I think, was for the People's, what did we call it? The People's
Hearing.
The People's Hearing, that's what it was. The People's Hearing on Clean Power Plan. I'm curious what you can tell us about you guys just sent out a message about it today, I think. I got an email about from the.
We did, and so for those who aren't aware of what we did here, and we partnered with it was the mayor's office, it was the attorney general, it was council member Constantinidis and the New School, together with a number of other organizations that helped co-sponsor the event, a real cross-section of the environmental and environmental justice communities here in the city and in the region. We had been calling for a hearing from the EPA on the Clean Power Plan. Very much opposed to the work to undermine and remove the Clean Power Plan from the books, and we've been fighting in court and in the press and everywhere we can to protect the Clean Power Plan, which is one of the key elements that we're going to be able to meet our obligations to the Paris Agreement. The EPA said no. So we said, well, if they don't want to hear from us, they're going to anyway. And so we held a hearing across really the entire day. We had hundreds of New Yorkers come in and testify up on this stage in this room, and we collected all of those comments, and we delivered a box of comments this week to the EPA, to a much chagrined EPA staffer who had to accept our box outside of the EPA regional headquarters here this week. And so the deadline for all of the comments on the Clean Power Plan was this week, I believe is this week. It may have been extended. But we've gotten the city's comments in. We joined the Attorney General with comments that he led across a number of other jurisdictions, and we delivered New Yorkers' comments on that, because initially the only hearing they were holding was in Charleston, West Virginia. We didn't think that was, that's good. That's not fully representative of the entire nation. They ultimately relented and did another one, I believe, in Kansas City, Wyoming, and San Francisco, and so they were entirely leaving out the Northeast, and so we felt that we had to step up and do that, and certainly thank you for your partnership on that, and to everyone who may have been participating in that, who's in the room today. Your voices are being heard, and we wanted to make sure that that was delivered to the EPA.
I see that there's a row of people starting to come up here, so Timon and then John will.
The plant.
Given the
you actually, by the way, confirmed his data. You weren't here this morning, but Timon started off with heat mortality. So
I felt like I got a check in my box there.
Well, maybe I did. Yeah.
Well, given the context of our discussion today, we've been talking a lot about Puerto Rico. We've been talking a lot about New York City, but we've also been talking about other aspects of climate change, in particular the way in which it's causing people to move around, right? Mobility, migration, and this is, sponsored and hosted by the Zolberg Center for Mobility and Migration. So I wanted to ask a little bit about how has New York responded to Puerto Rico and the movement of people? So sort of picking up on the last panel and thinking about this in particular, like we've been talking about all the work that New York has done around energy efficiency and all the work it's been doing around heat and flooding and post-Sandy work, but where are we now in terms of thinking about movement of people, in particular movement of people into New York, right, from other areas. And maybe you can talk about what we know about Puerto Rico too, just to kind of pull those things together.
No, I can cover a couple of those things, and I think we're already starting to see people who you would probably start to call climate refugees, climate migrants. There are people moving because of environmental risk, environmental threats, and climate change, and it's happening within the city. There's already a neighborhood in Staten Island that doesn't exist. Oakwood Beach, because after Hurricane Sandy, they applied for and were able to receive a buyout for the entire community, and the state bought out all their property, and really what's left, and there's maybe just a handful of holdouts, it's most of the houses have been demolished. It's being returned to nature, and so we've already seen people move. Now, the challenge in that is where do people go, of course, and I think some of the statistics and some of the analysis is showing that some people ended up in perhaps just as vulnerable locations after that fact. And so I don't think that full analysis and study has been done yet, but that's a really key component of people moving and making sure that they don't end up in just as vulnerable a location. Then we saw what happened, and we've certainly seen the lessons from Puerto Rico. And after Hurricane Maria, because of the close ties between New York City and Puerto Rico and the family connections, a lot of Puerto Ricans came to New York City, and I believe a couple thousand signed up in the service centers that the city had set up. So we had a bit of a test run, right, for what it might mean that people are moving and where they're going. And I find a lot of hope in things like IDNYC, where new residents can start to get access to services by signing up for municipal ID. We had to set up service centers and help people integrate into the city and get their kids in schools and healthcare needs and all of those sort of just normal human conditions that you have to consider when people are moving. And then also we stepped up, and as the temporary shelter assistance was about to run out, the city said it was going to cover that cost. I believe FEMA finally relented and is now covering that cost for the final about 100 families that were still living in hotel shelter here in New York City. And so we had a bit of a dry run, right? And I think it was certainly, in Puerto Rico, it was a devastating disaster. Here in New York City, there were impacts, and we had to begin to think about how to adapt to them. And I believe we're going to see more of that. And we're going to see more of that in places that are not as high capacity as New York City either. And I think we already are seeing that across the globe. And we all have some work to do to think about how to integrate new residents into our cities and how to find the opportunity that comes from that, and not think of it as the burden. And I know my friends at the World Bank, who I saw here today, have done some really interesting work on this topic and how many people across the globe are projected to move, and the analysis on what that might mean in different parts of the world. And I encourage everyone to check that work out. Again, we got a bit of a dry run. I think we learned some things from it, and we have to continue to adapt to that as well.
So today we've been hearing, as Joel said, some hopeful stories and also some stories about how things have really fallen apart. And I guess I'd ask you, with your background in engineering, when you fundamentally look at the systems that are in place now on an engineering level, on a political level, on a social level, do you feel that we are actually capable of addressing these basic challenges of climate-induced migration? Do we have the tools that are necessary to ultimately come up with some kind of satisfactory result?
I guess I'm struggling a little bit on, I'm sure that's not just a yes or no question, right? There's
No, it isn't.
Yes, we do.
Yeah. Done. Next question. Again, I think we've learned a ton from what has happened already, but the scale of the challenge of what is to come will dwarf everything that's happened to date. Just some basic sort of numbers of, we've seen a foot of sea level rise in the last 100 years. Well, in the next 35 years, we may see another 2.5. And so the sort of slowly creeping challenge that may have caused some issues, and it may have led to a higher incidence of damage in Hurricane Sandy, and therefore might have caused more people to be on the move after Hurricane Sandy, it's going to be much more rapid. And are our systems capable of keeping up with accelerating change? I think globally, generally not. I don't think so. I think we will only be able to get to a place where we are able to keep up with that accelerating change if we're all focused on the challenges and understanding that climate is going to exacerbate lots of other social challenges, and it's not just about the water and the heat and the storms. It is about the food and public health and migration and security. And unless we can talk about that and have a broader conversation about that as a nation and as a globe, we're not going to keep up. But I think we have to get to that point in order to keep up.
But I want to follow up on that, because that is really the question that I was alluding to in the beginning between these two different books, right? Because in both instances, it's about keeping focused on the urgency of this question, and which is largely a political question to some degree.
Right.
And I mean, so saying we have to, and that maybe even some thoughts about how we do. Because I think that shift to the positive, and without, this is not a kind of, easy solution moment or some kind of naive, yes, we can sort of statement, but it really does require, I think, ultimately a shift in some way to saying we can solve this problem, but there has to be a kind of commitment level, and how do we get to that? I think that's the thing I'm at least struggling with today.
I think we're all struggling with it. Right? I think, and we're struggling with it because most of us, I think the numbers I've seen, 70% of Americans know that greenhouse gas emissions are causing climate change and want to do something about it. I might have my number wrong, but it's something like that. And yet there are, having just read the book, merchants of doubt out there, and people that want to spread the uncertainty for their own purposes. And so none of us have an answer on how to deal with this political divide that we have as a nation, and a major political party that wants to not take action on this for their own purposes and because money from big oil is flowing into campaigns and any other number of things that I'm sure I don't have to go further on. And so None of us have an answer to that, but we need to break that divide, right? And part of our answer on that is why we are pursuing an accountability component to our climate work. It's not just about the greenhouse gas emissions and the flood protection and the heat mitigation. It's why we are suing Exxon and Chevron and 3 other fossil fuel companies. It's why we're divesting our pension funds. We need to get this into a broader movement and bring accountability to this and sort of, break the back of that uncertainty coalition that is aligned and bringing lots of money into not having an answer to this challenge.
Yeah. I think you have a lot of people in this room that want to help you with it. Thank you. Walter.
Hey, Dan.
Walter?
So first is a compliment and then a question. I've been in the field monthly in Puerto Rico, and I've been, especially in San Juan, in the capital, in the big cities, so proud to see all the departments of New York City in the field working in a formal way. From Parks Department chopping at trees, and they don't even know tropical trees, to Police Department, you name it, even National Grid, all these guys. But and that was amazing. And also it's been an amazing collaboration between the humanitarian horizontal space and the vertical resources of government, no matter how little they are, but how the regional governments have really stepped in. But now to the question. So last year, I think, was it last summer, Jennifer, in Stockholm, or was that the summer before? I can't remember. Yeah. Timon McPherson, who you saw, and Jennifer, and a few of us went to Stockholm for the Resilience Conference, and there was very little funding for science, so that we were pretty much representing our country there, and everyone was saying, "Where's the Americans?" We're like, "We're here." But,
Thank you for doing that.
One thing that came out of it, one thing that a big takeaway was a big arc that, with Brexit and where we are with this administration, that a human geographer explained to me what's going on globally. She said, as a societal organization, we shifted from familial tribal structures to to religious structures of organizing society, then to national, and then we peaked at global, and then she's saying we're disaggregating to what she's calling bioregional. And you put that back into our American context, and what I'm seeing in the red states that we're working in on resiliency, but not in sustainability, because red states don't acknowledge sustainability, but they will talk about resiliency, is places like Florida or Mississippi coast, is that we're seeing the blue state, like the blue cities, leading the red state resiliency discussion, right? And that's kind of interesting. Our reference points to New York City and what they did post-Sandy. What did South Beach do in Miami? And what's formed in these red states are these blue regions, these sub-state or subnational conditions, like the Climate Compact of South Florida, which is universities, counties, governors, everyone that has resources sharing knowledge and financial resources to harden for the region. We're seeing the Pacific Northwest, Seattle, Portland, and Vancouver. So the question is, what's happening in New England? What do you project, for thinking about the bioregion of New England to offset, the inadequate federal response to climate change?
Well, I think, I'm not sure necessarily it's a New England thing, but I'm trying to wrap my head around the bioregional. I could think about things like RGGI, the regional greenhouse gas emission trading scheme that we have for power plants, and how that's largely, and now that New Jersey's in, and Virginia. So you have Virginia, I think all the way up to Maine, that's participating in RGGI. And so there is already a component there. There's other networks that are sort of self-forming. Climate mayors, so the day after Trump withdrew from the Paris Agreement or announced his intention to withdraw, we signed an executive order the next day committing New York City, and over the course of the next 2 weeks or so, those sort of commitments it was like 400 cities across the United States have come together, some doing more than others, of course, but there's already loose coalitions forming there. Then there's high ambition networks like C40 or 100 Resilient Cities that are coming together. And so in different ways, people are finding ways to organize. And at the state level, you have New York and California and the U.S. Climate Alliance, I believe it's called. So there are organizations coming together. And then there's sort of coalitions where you've got the We Are Still In campaign, university organizations, business organizations, states, cities, all saying that we are going to deliver on America's pledge to the Paris commitment. And so it points to a silver lining, at least in this Trump moment of withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, that we're now actually actively having this conversation. We didn't hear much about climate during the 2016 election, but now we're talking about it more and what the impacts are in forums like this and lots of other forums as well. But it's actually becoming a more broad-based conversation. You're seeing it more in mass media. And then separately, the other silver lining is that no one has the illusion that the federal government's going to solve this for us. And so we are coming together and saying we are going to do everything we can. We're going to pull every lever, and we're going to find every friend and partner to move things forward as well. And so, it's one other reason that, to answer the first question, that gives me hope is that lots of people do want to solve this and find ways to overcome the institutional inertia that exists at the federal level and from fossil fuel companies. So.
Hi. So you said that this kind of like this group of people coming from Puerto Rico after Maria has served as like a test run for the city to see how they're prepared for this kind of situations in the future. So I don't know if you can speak a little bit more about which challenges you saw in that, like where did the preparedness fall short, some kind of lessons, and how are we better prepared for this season of hurricanes that can, like it's going to start in June, and who knows if we have another Maria or a bigger Maria bringing more people in, and how is the city better prepared for that?
I would almost love to hear some feedback for us on how we've done, because walking in, we're the conquering heroes, but I'm sure we have plenty to learn from and do more of. And so, even if other people have some commentary, what things have we learned on this? We've learned, not surprisingly, that we are incredibly housing stressed as a city, and we were even before. More people wanted to move here or were forced to come here for either temporarily or to relocate, and that's just something we're dealing with as a city, and we need to keep building more housing and make sure that we deal with the affordability of New York City. I don't necessarily have direct feedback on the services that we set up and the intake centers, what could have gone better, what went right, the access to things like IDNYC and the uptake there. So I actually would love to hear if people had direct experience and things that we should hear. Please feel free to send those our way. But I know that some things certainly went well, and a lot of other things could go a lot worse if there's a bigger event that we have to deal with, and we need to keep getting better. So.
Okay, last question.
Hi. I just wanted to make
Okay. If you both ask your question, then maybe Dan will answer them in that kind of.
Yeah. A question about policy continuity between the Bloomberg administration and de Blasio. So in Plan New York, the tool of zoning was used to sort of put together the narrative that we needed to develop more housing in transit-oriented areas. And that ended up being places like Greenpoint and Williamsburg, in areas that were actually defined by FEMA flood-prone areas. And a lot of that development happened. We see it today. And it was driven by an elite of corporate developer agencies and transnational corporations that like to have housing here in New York. Now, I would like to ask you what kind of continuity there is with that kind of policymaking in the de Blasio administration. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Danny, I just wanted to say today, even from learning from you last week, I think New York is really on the cutting edge and doing lots of interesting things. I just have a question. Sitting where you are, do you think that there are any blind spots that New York City has that you either can address or haven't thought, if you haven't thought about it, you haven't thought about it, but that you think about but which have been difficult to address? Just curious.
I want to answer that one first, because first thing I think is it's sort of a tautology of I don't know what my blind spots are because I can't see them. And so, we talk about what we're doing as a comprehensive program and how we're dealing with mitigation or adaptation and accountability, and yet I'm sure I'm constantly presented with, well, why haven't you guys thought about this or that or the other? And it's usually, yeah, you're right. Let's go think about those things as well. And there's, I think we're all adapting to to this great, enormous challenge, and the palette of that we have to work with, the toolbox that we have to work with, I think needs to expand greatly. And so I don't have a particular, this is my blind spot, but I think if I had to answer that question, it's really about how do we get more people to think that they have power to act in this conversation. And it's not just, I'm going to rely on my government to do something, but I have the power in my own life to make choices and decisions. And if we do a good job telling people that, and doing the education and information on how people can do that, you're also then building the base of political support for larger challenges that are outside of people's control. And so I think there's something there that we all need to get better at. And I guess I'll close with answering a housing question. I'm not the zoning expert necessarily, but certainly as an official that did carry through from the Bloomberg administration into the de Blasio administration, I have a bit of insight into this. And if you look at what we're doing in this administration on zoning and housing, we are absolutely delivering on those sort of visions of densifying areas that are around transit, and whether it's in East New York or we're looking in areas in the Bronx around Jerome Avenue and other areas. So what may have been zoned in the last administration, yes, there may have been some flood-prone areas there. Building newer buildings at least is putting them at the highest standard and building them to the highest codes, and so reducing some risk and turning over some older building stock into newer building stock. I think that actually does make those buildings safer, but the direction where we've been looking for housing across New York City has in most cases has been away from the coast and in parts of the city that are transit served, but need neighborhood development and investment for the residents that live in those neighborhoods. And I think the East New York is a great example of that, of using the Broadway Junction neighborhood that is well served by transit, and we're investing in the neighborhood as it is and working to continue to add more housing that we need as a city. So I'm not sure if that fully answers your question, but I think there's a lot that's happening there. And for us to add 300, so to preserve and add, develop 300,000 units by 2026, I believe is the commitment, we have to do a lot more of that, and we are ahead of our goals on that measure.
So Alex is standing up, which is the sign to say, first of all, thank you to Dan. So
thank you very much for having me.
Being here. I think the great challenge of being in a city like New York that is doing this work is holding our own feet to the fire. And New Yorkers are never shy of our opinions. We shouldn't be. But it is true that being here provides a certain level of comfort and pride in a notion in a country that is struggling to deal with this, in a world that's struggling to deal with this. We are making great strides thanks to your work and others. But I do think that urgency question, that communication question, the focus question is the one that at least I walk away from today saying, I keep coming back to it.
If I could have maybe one last word on this then, is the thing that weighs on me most in this conversation is that we need to continue to stay out in front. And because as the media capital of the world, what we do here gets noticed. When we committed to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions 80% by 2050, city after city followed suit. Now that we've committed to divest our pension funds and we're suing fossil fuel companies, more and more cities are calling us up and saying, how do we do that too? Yeah. And so we need to continue to stay out in front, and please, if you see our blind spots, tell us, because we need to hear it. So thank you.
Thanks, Dan.
Dan, thanks so much. I really appreciate you taking the time on the end of a Friday. And Joel, thanks for doing double duty for us here. I just want to say just a very brief concluding remark. It's been a really terrific day, I think, and I'm thinking about this in terms of concentric circles because this conference has brought the New School together by bringing Parsons and Tishman Center and the Urban Systems Lab and the Zolberg Institute together. And then our work, I hope, which we've started and will continue with the city, and then partners in the world, looking at the World Bank and other partners, and then hopefully beyond with on the global scene as well. And I think we've got to make progress on all those steps. I do want to take just a second to thank some people. First of all, from our team at the Zolberg Institute, Casey Pack, our associate director, did really an awful lot of the work here, and made it all go smoothly. And Amanda Porter, who wrote email after email to all of you, I think, in the room. Thank you very much. Guillermina Altamonte, also a research assistant at the Zolberg Institute, who, believe it or not, we did a 1-credit course here over the course of today for students who attended a 2-hour lecture and then attended the conference, and will now have to write a page that may or may not be graded depending on the strike, I guess, that'll happen here. We'll see. And then to Julia Morris, postdoc at the Zolberg Institute, who ran the competition and also helped out in lots of ways. To all the panelists who are still here, thank you so much for making the time to be with us. We'll stay in touch with you. And to all the participants, I hope we learned a lot, and we will take this forward. These are big issues that really, for this city, for the nation, and for the world. And I don't want to get too grandiose about it, but I think the New School has a lot to offer, and I hope we really pull ourselves together and continue this work the way that many people here have been doing a lot of work on this long before the Zolberg Institute got involved, but we will hopefully pick up an oar in the boat and row along with the rest of you now. Dan, thanks again for being with us. Thanks to you all. Have a great weekend.